Edward Elric and the Moral Psychology of Guilt. Edward Elric, the protagonist of Fullmetal Alchemist, occupies a distinctive position within manga literature, not merely as a heroic figure, but as a sustained psychological case study in moral development. His narrative arc is not defined by the accumulation of power, but by the transformation of ethical understanding. Unlike traditional heroic narratives that equate moral worth with endurance or solitary suffering, Edward's journey systematically dismantles that assumption. Early in the narrative, Edward believes that pain endured in isolation is morally purifying. He treats suffering as currency, something that can be exchanged to atone for harm. By the later arcs, however, Edward arrives at a radically different conclusion. Refusing help is not strength, but a form of moral withdrawal. Accepting aid becomes paradoxically an ethical act rather than a weakness. Edward Elric, a child forced into moral adulthood. Edward Elric's defining tragedy is not merely the loss of limbs or the failure of human transmutation, it is the premature assignment of moral adulthood. As a child, Edward assumes responsibility for forces, death, creation, equivalence that no human, let alone a child, can ethically or psychologically bear. The failed transmutation of his mother is the moment where Edward's moral worldview crystallizes. It is here that he internalizes a devastating conclusion: harm must always be paid for personally. From this point forward, Edward's ethics are structured around atonement rather than relationship. This is not heroism, it is a coping mechanism. Guilt as the core organizing principle. Edward's psychology is dominated by guilt not in a vague emotional sense, but as a structural moral force. Guilt becomes the lens through which all ethical decisions are filtered. He does not ask, what is the right action, but rather, what suffering do I owe? This distinction is crucial. In guilt-driven morality, responsibility is individualized, pain is moral proof, help is morally suspect. Edward's early worldview reflects all three. Self-sacrifice as moral logic. Edward's self-sacrificial tendencies are often misread as noble altruism. In reality, they are rooted in moral overcompensation. He believes that because he caused harm, he must suffer alone to correct it. This creates a closed ethical system in which moral worth is measured by endurance rather than relational impact. This belief explains his refusal to rely on others, his anger when Alphonse risks himself, his distrust of external assistance. Self-sacrifice becomes a way to control moral chaos. Equivalent exchange as psychological metaphor. The law of equivalent exchange is not merely an alchemical rule, it is Edward's psychological anchor. It offers the illusion of fairness in a universe that has already proven unfair. If everything has a cost, then suffering can be quantified, controlled, and eventually exhausted. However, the ethical flaw in this worldview becomes increasingly apparent. Human relationships do not operate on transactional balance. Edward's insistence on paying all costs himself gradually isolates him from the very relationships that could allow healing. The ethical isolation paradox. Edward's moral isolation is self-reinforcing. The more he suffers alone, the more justified he feels in refusing help. The more he refuses help, the more isolated he becomes. This creates a paradox. His attempt to protect others ultimately distances him from them. This is not merely tragic, it is ethically flawed. Edward Elric's transformation challenges deeply ingrained cultural narratives about strength, responsibility, and virtue. His story suggests that moral adulthood is not defined by how much suffering one can endure alone, but by how willing one is to share responsibility with others. This makes Edward Elric one of the most psychologically and ethically sophisticated protagonists in modern manga. Over-responsibility and moral hyperagency. A defining feature of Edward's early psychology is moral hyperagency, the belief that he is responsible not only for his actions, but for outcomes beyond his reasonable control. This manifests in his relationship with Alphonse, whose disembodied existence becomes the ultimate proof of Edward's perceived moral failure. Edward does not treat Alphonse's condition as a shared tragedy, he treats it as a debt. The language of obligation dominates his thinking. He must fix what he broke, he must pay what he owes. There is no space for shared burden or distributed responsibility. The suppression of dependency. Dependency in Edward's early worldview is synonymous with moral weakness. To rely on others would imply that his suffering is insufficient or incomplete. This leads to a systematic suppression of vulnerability, yet vulnerability is not eliminated, it is displaced into anger. Edward's volatility, impatience, and defensiveness function as protective barriers against exposure. By presenting himself as combative and self-reliant, he avoids confronting the terror of being forgiven or supported, the illusion of moral purity. By suffering alone, Edward believes he preserves moral purity. He avoids implicating others, avoids spreading harm, and avoids shared guilt. Yet this purity is illusory. Moral life is inherently relational. Harm, responsibility, and repair cannot be confined to a single individual when relationships are involved. Edward's early ethics thus achieve internal consistency at the cost of relational truth. Alchemy as moral metaphor. Equivalent exchange and the limits of transactional ethics. Equivalent exchange as worldview, not rule. Within Fullmetal Alchemist, equivalent exchange is often presented as a technical principle of alchemy. However, for Edward Elric, it functions less as a scientific law and more as a comprehensive moral ontology. It explains not only how matter transforms, but how responsibility, loss, and justice ought to operate. Edward internalizes equivalent exchange at a formative stage before he has developed the psychological capacity to differentiate between natural law and ethical obligation. As a result, he conflates descriptive balance with prescriptive morality. What is becomes what ought to be. This conflation is the cornerstone of Edward's early ethical system, transactional morality and the illusion of fairness. Transactional morality assumes that all harm can be offset by proportionate cost. Within this framework, justice is achieved when balance is restored. Edward's reliance on this logic reflects a deep psychological need, the desire for a universe where tragedy is not arbitrary. Equivalent exchange reassures him that nothing is lost without cause, nothing is gained without payment. Moral chaos can be reduced to calculation. However, this framework collapses when applied to human suffering. Emotional loss does not obey conservation laws. Grief does not dissipate when paid for. Edward's continued pain despite his sacrifices gradually exposes the insufficiency of transactional ethics, the moralization of cost. Edward's psychological error is not believing in cost, it is moralizing cost. He assumes that paying more entitles him to moral clarity. This leads to a dangerous equivalence. Suffering becomes synonymous with virtue. Within this logic, to suffer is to be morally serious. To avoid suffering is to be morally suspect. To accept help is to evade cost. This framework explains Edward's instinctive rejection of shortcuts, external aid, or outcomes not directly earned through pain. He fears unearned resolution not because it is unjust, but because it threatens his moral identity. Equivalent exchange and the denial of grace. Grace, understood here as unearned restoration or forgiveness, has no place within equivalent exchange. Edward's moral system cannot accommodate it. To accept grace would be to admit that some harms cannot be repaid and that some losses require acknowledgement rather than compensation. This is psychologically intolerable for Edward at this stage. Grace implies vulnerability, dependency, and relinquishment of control. It requires trust in others rather than reliance on self-inflicted suffering. Thus, Edward resists not only help, but the concept of help. Alchemy as cognitive defense. Alchemy provides Edward with a language of structure and predictability. It is not merely a tool, but a cognitive defense mechanism. Through alchemy, Edward transforms the unpredictability of life into a system governed by rules. This defensive function becomes evident in moments of ethical ambiguity. When faced with moral dilemmas, Edward defaults to alchemical logic, cost, exchange, equivalence. This allows him to avoid confronting questions that have no calculable answers, such as, when is forgiveness appropriate? Who bears responsibility for shared harm? What cannot be repaired? Alchemy delays these questions but cannot eliminate them. The psychological cost of total self-reliance. Transactional ethics demands self-sufficiency. If all debts must be paid personally, then dependence becomes a liability. Edward's growing isolation is not incidental, it is structurally required by his worldview. This isolation produces several psychological consequences: emotional suppression, chronic anger, difficulty trusting others' intentions. Edward's abrasive demeanor is not simply temperament, it is the behavioral expression of an ethical system that cannot tolerate vulnerability. The cultural myth of noble suffering. Edward Elric's early ethical posture is reinforced by a widely accepted cultural myth that suffering borne alone is inherently virtuous. Within heroic narratives, endurance is often equated with moral superiority, and self-sacrifice is framed as the highest ethical act. Fullmetal Alchemist initially appears to participate in this tradition, only to later dismantle it. Edward internalizes this myth completely. He does not merely accept suffering as inevitable. He actively seeks it as confirmation of moral seriousness. Pain becomes not a consequence of ethical action, but its validation. This shift is subtle but decisive. When suffering is treated as proof of virtue, ethics become performative rather than relational. Anger as protective mechanism. Edward's frequent anger is often misinterpreted as immaturity. In reality, it serves a protective ethical function. Anger creates distance. It discourages intimacy and deters offers of help. It reinforces the boundary between the self-sacrificing agent and the protected other. From a psychological perspective, anger allows Edward to maintain control over moral space. Vulnerability would invite shared responsibility, which his worldview cannot tolerate. Thus, anger becomes an ethical shield, the emergence of moral doubt. Repeated failures introduce doubt into Edward's ethical framework. He begins to question whether self-sacrifice is truly protective or merely symbolic. This doubt is not immediately articulated. but it manifests in hesitation, internal conflict, and moments of relational openness. These moments mark the beginning of ethical transition. Edward's certainty erodes, making space for alternative moral configurations. The turn toward mutual dependence, accepting help as an ethical act. Edward Elric's ethical transformation does not occur through sudden revelation or ideological conversion. It emerges through the gradual collapse of the solitary moral ideal he has sustained since childhood. The evidence against isolation accumulates not in theory but in lived consequence. Edward observes that despite his sacrifices, outcomes remain uncertain. More importantly, he observes that others persist in acting ethically even when he attempts to exclude them. This persistence undermines his belief that moral responsibility must be centralized in a single agent. The collapse of the solitary ideal is not liberating. At first, it is destabilizing. Edward must confront the possibility that his long-held understanding of strength has been ethically incomplete. The ethical reframing of dependence. In Edward's early framework, dependence was synonymous with weakness. It implied moral insufficiency and evasion of cost. In this new phase, dependence is reframed as ethical participation. To accept help is no longer understood as transferring burden unjustly, but as acknowledging shared stake in outcomes. Dependence becomes a recognition of relational reality rather than a moral lapse. This reframing marks a fundamental ethical shift. Responsibility is no longer measured by how much one bears alone, but by how one participates with others. The psychological dismantling of guilt-based identity. Edward's willingness to accept help signals the beginning of the dissolution of his guilt-based identity. Guilt no longer serves as the primary organizer of moral action. Instead, responsibility becomes contextual and relational. This does not eliminate guilt, but it prevents guilt from monopolizing ethical judgment. Edward begins to differentiate between what he caused, what he could not prevent, what must now be faced together. This differentiation is the hallmark of psychological maturation. Responsibility without total control. One of the most difficult lessons Edward learns is that responsibility does not require total control. Ethical life often demands action in conditions of uncertainty, where outcomes cannot be guaranteed. By accepting help, Edward acknowledges the limits of his agency. This acknowledgement does not weaken moral resolve, it grounds it in reality. Responsibility becomes forward-looking rather than compensatory. The focus shifts from repaying past harm to shaping future action. The emergence of relational trust. Mutual dependence requires trust. Not merely emotional trust, but ethical trust. Edward must trust that others will act responsibly, just as others must trust him. This trust is fragile and earned gradually. It is reinforced through shared decision-making, collective risk, and reciprocal accountability. Trust replaces control as the stabilizing force of Edward's ethical life, from guilt to relation. Edward Elric and the ethics of shared moral life. Edward Elric's journey in Fullmetal Alchemist is often summarized as a quest for restoration of bodies, of balance, of justice. However, such summaries obscure the deeper transformation that defines his arc. At its core, Edward's story is not about reclaiming what was lost, but about learning how responsibility must be lived. The redefinition of responsibility. Edward's mature ethic does not eliminate responsibility, it redistributes it. Responsibility becomes relational rather than solitary, forward-looking rather than compensatory. This redefinition allows Edward to act ethically without assuming omnipotence. He accepts that moral life unfolds under conditions of uncertainty and shared vulnerability. Responsibility is no longer measured by suffering endured, but by engagement sustained. Edward Elric and contemporary moral psychology. Edward's arc resonates strongly with contemporary moral psychology, particularly critiques of hyper-individualistic ethics. His journey illustrates the limitations of rule-based and transaction-focused moral reasoning when confronted with human complexity. By embracing relational responsibility, Edward aligns with ethical frameworks that emphasize care, interdependence, and contextual judgment. This positions Fullmetal Alchemist as a work of exceptional philosophical depth. Why Edward Elric endures. Edward Elric endures as a protagonist not because he is flawless, but because his flaws are ethically instructive. His journey speaks to universal human struggles: guilt, control, vulnerability, and the fear of dependence. His ultimate lesson is neither simple nor comforting. To live morally is to accept that one cannot do so alone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like and subscribe.